So thank you everybody for joining us today for the CREST Day of Incident Response webinars. And we're finishing our day today with a presentation from the President of CREST, Ian Glover, and it's to talk about the CREST Cybersecurity Global Ecosystem Project. So just before I hand over to Ian, I'd just like to go through that you will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you wish to at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to type in the question pane during the presentation so that you don't forget any burning questions that you may want to ask, and you can type in at the end, and we'll try and get as many of those questions asked for you before the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for those of you that have joined us from other presentations, and welcome to the new attendees. And on that note, I'll hand over to Ian. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Once again, what I'd like to do is to thank Debbie and her team for such a good job today, and I do hope that you had the opportunity to listen to some of the presentations earlier on today. They have been excellent, really good, and I would also point you towards some of the other presentations we have on our YouTube channel, particularly those that we recorded for the intelligence-led penetration testing and threat intelligence areas, because those were excellent as well. I've been asked to provide a bit of an update in terms of some of the work that we are currently doing, looking at global cybersecurity ecosystems. And what I'm trying to do through the presentation is also to link that to some of the activities that we are planning to do this year in relation to incident response. So, as you know, CREST's overall mission is to build capacity, capability and consistency within the cybersecurity market. And very much for this project, I think we're building on those three primary principles in a number of ways. And what we're actually trying to do is to build trust in the cybersecurity expertise in organisations and individuals, specifically looking at the African and Asian market. And that is very much to help the local markets to address the growing cybersecurity risk, particularly those to digital financial services, but also to encourage international organisations to help and to provide services in those countries as well. So very much market analysis driven. We've been very fortunate in terms of obtaining a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to actually look at this. And really it fits in with some of their major initiatives. And the most important one from our perspective is this allowing access to digital financial services for the poor. Their view is to raise people out of poverty, you should give them access to financial services, but those financial services need to be provided in a safe and secure manner. And really, if that is in place, so in other words, access, safety and security are in place, then we believe you can actually start to achieve that level of inclusion that they're trying to look for. The good thing is that they listen very much in terms of the approaches we take in other parts of the world to grow the ecosystems within countries. And their view very much is that should be built through both a regulatory, both government and regulatory, and a market partnership model. And that's very much the approach that's been taken for this project. So from my perspective, this is a really important initiative, and one of those projects where you actually feel like you can make a real tangible difference. The project itself initially was to look at the development of a maturity model assessment, and we've actually conducted that now in year one of the project. We're now heading into year two. We're asked to include 8 countries: Nigeria, Uganda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia. But we've already had a huge amount of international interest in terms of what we've been doing, and we are already doing work in Rwanda. We're already started to do some of the quantitative analysis in Ghana. We have plans to roll the model out to South Africa and also to countries in the Middle East and Australasia. So already we are beginning to build the model further, and I think that's very important because it will allow much more comparative work to be done between the different countries. We've looked at 20 different fields per country in terms of the different elements of the ecosystem. And we've created more than 4,000 unique references to external material. We have 36,000 active database entries on the country files that we have in place. And what we're doing is we're moving all of that data and those external references over to a relational database. And the whole concept is to make as much of that information available to the public to consume as possible. That will allow further research to be conducted. It will allow the service providers to do the market analysis. It will allow governments and regulators to understand whether or not the activities they're doing are actually making a tangible and measurable difference to the level of security within countries. So I think there's a huge amount of really good information there, and we are trying to make as much of it available as possible. As part of the quantitative analysis, we've also looked at more than 600 financial services institutions. We've identified those through a very structured way, looking at a range of different financial services within each of the countries. And we've done that quantitative analysis in quite a lot of detail using one of our third parties. And we are in the process of producing 8 individual country reports and also a summary. That will be completed over the next couple of months. And again, all of those country reports will be available for public consumption. The roadmap is that we've done the research, which is very much doing the qualitative analysis, looking at the information that we've gathered about each of the different elements of the process. We've done in-country briefings. Due to COVID restrictions, those have all been done remotely, but we had very good feedback in terms of the process and what we're trying to achieve. Once we've gathered the information, we ran validation workshops in each country, and we've taken on board all of the comments and observations that people have had and areas where we needed further consideration, and that's all been completed. And we're now in a position where we're doing the assessment and reporting. We've just done the country presentations for all 8 countries. We completed the last one yesterday. We're now moving into year 2, which is very much the development of good practice guides and tools. It's an unusual project because normally the client is the person that's going to consume the output. But from this particular area, what we're doing is we are providing advice and governance to key stakeholders, including governments, regulators, service providers, the buying community, academia and training, professional bodies, etc. But the project is actually the responsibility of the Gates Foundation. So we are being very careful in terms of managing people's expectation about what we can provide in year 2 and also moving forward. But again, I think we're in a very strong position to be able to provide direct support, and we're already having conversations in country with governments, regulators, and we're seeing a significant level of interest in terms of things like CREST membership. From our approach for year 2, therefore, we have already gained that current understanding of the situation through the use of our maturity model. We've been using maturity models for quite some time, and we've been trying to make assessments, but this particular grant has allowed us to formalise that process into what I believe is an extremely effective maturity model. We've also tied that and linked it with other maturity models, such as those being run by Oxford University, for example, and some of the other indexes that are provided in terms of country performance in terms of cybersecurity. But that gaining of a current understanding of the current situation is where we are. What we've also done is we've identified where good practice exists to support the existing development of the ecosystem. So where there is good practice within the countries we've looked at, or we've identified good practice on an international stage, that's where those cross-references from the relational database will be provided. Not unsurprisingly, there was quite a few areas where there is actually no good practice guidance and no tools to support that ecosystem development. And therefore, the next phase of our project is to go forward and produce a lot of those tools and good practice guidance to actually provide direct support to countries. We are also looking to pump prime. We have resources available to put in-country resources to provide direct support to governments, regulators, the buying community, etc. But we haven't actually got that in place yet. So again, we are planning to do that for year 2. The maturity model assessment itself we've called SAMAGE, and it's based, as most maturity model assessments are, on a 5-level color-coded maturity model structure. That sounds very traditional, and certainly the quality of all the desktop research we've done to gather all of that current position material, it is very much in line with what you'd normally expect to see from traditional maturity models. I think one of the big differences we are working towards is the availability of the quantitative assessments. And in actual fact, looking at the vulnerabilities you can see externally from the outside world, and also therefore taking much more of a quantitative assessment in terms of the level of vulnerability that organisations are exposed to, and also the level of threat that they are also experiencing. So that quantitative analysis, we believe, is quite unique to actually moving forward with this type of approach, and we believe this is one of the major differentiators. And Orpheus is the organisation that's helped us, and I'd like to thank them for their support. The qualitative analysis is based on the indicators of the thematic findings as well. So what we've done is we've gathered information from penetration testing results, we've looked at the results from incidents, and we've looked at some of the thematic findings that have come forward from some of the regulators and governments that we work with. And what we've tried to do is to identify those major areas in terms of where vulnerabilities are being exploited in the real world. So very much all of the things that we've been talking about today throughout the day on incident response. As I've said, all of the evidence, observation and everything, we're going to put into that relational database. And we're going to therefore have the ability to conduct reassessments to measure progress. And that's again another key point in terms of providing a key performance indicator, an initial benchmark, and then measurements of performance, we believe is something that's been missing from a lot of the maturity models we've seen, and is certainly missing from some of the national security strategies. The model consists of 20 indicators across 5 dimensions. These are the dimensions. We are looking at the national cybersecurity strategies and capabilities, and that includes law enforcement, which is the cybercrime units, an area that probably didn't have as much debate today as I expected in terms of incident response. And it also includes the provision of prevent activities, including intervention points to stop vulnerable and young people being groomed into cybercrime activities. Some of the only areas, I believe, where you can actually start to affect the threat. We then look at cybersecurity information sharing. So in other words, the certs and the information sharing platforms and how that information is consumed. And again, I think that we as an industry, particularly in incident response, can be providing more information into those certs and information sharing platforms to make sure the most current threat scenarios and the most current attack processes are actually reflected in there. We then look at the cybersecurity service provider areas. In other words, to see whether or not there is a vibrant community of quality organisations providing services. We look at the areas of professional development, which includes academia, training and others. And then we're looking specifically at the banking sector in this particular instance from a quantitative analysis perspective. But we strongly believe that although we're doing this on behalf of the Gates Foundation looking at the banking sector, that all of the processes we have in place can be applied to all areas of the critical national infrastructure, and they all have a contribution to play. So I would personally very much like to see particularly the quantitative analysis be extended into other areas of the CNI. The quantitative analysis, which is that dimension 5, as I've mentioned, is based on the thematic findings and the results we've seen from penetration testing and also real-life incidents. And these are the 4 primary areas that we started to measure. So we are looking to establish whether or not there is infrastructure vulnerability risk. And what we've done is broken that down into 2 levels, very much based on the normal metrics you would see in terms of vulnerabilities. And in this pure example version, you can see here that 5% of the organisations assessed, those financial services organisations assessed, have at least one critical vulnerability exposed to the internet. So all of this analysis has been done by doing non-intrusive vulnerability analysis scanning based on some of that, but we found it very surprising in terms of our analysis that we were still finding organisations in the financial services market that had very significant vulnerabilities that were old and easily patchable, and they were visible from the external viewpoint. I think that both increases the vulnerability and the threat. And then moving on that, at least 52% in this indicator had at least critical or otherwise defined vulnerabilities as well. So if you look at that, then there are really areas of basic cyber hygiene that we think could be addressed and should be addressed within these types of organisations. Obviously, email authentication is a very important aspect, and we looked at that from two perspectives, both FPS and DMARC. And you can see here that, again, we are monitoring those two things in tandem, if you like. So we can see here that the very basic level of email control here, so in other words, the SPF, we've identified 45%, but we are still seeing 53% that haven't implemented any form of advanced email protection or authentication. And again, these are things that you would expect to see in terms of basic cyber hygiene. I think it's interesting, we have seen some country initiatives, particularly in this space, where the scores have been significantly better than the norm. And therefore, I think establishing a strategy for some technology-related aspects is a really good thing to do and can make a tangible difference. I think the problem in the past has been the ability to actually measure that performance. Obviously, security architecture is very important, and things like having open ports, for example, and those open ports having vulnerabilities is another important consideration and measurement. So again, what we're seeing in this just example is around about 8%. We've got at least one remote access service that is potentially vulnerable, and the other measure we have is in terms of database services. So again, very much looking at that architectural risk. And again, I think these are areas where we can easily make improvements. And then we've got information leakage, which is very much orientated towards awareness, for example, and that's a very difficult thing to measure. So what we've done is we've looked at the financial institutions having their employee credentials leaked online for one or more third-party databases. It's interesting looking at some of the other presentations that were described today, that this was certainly an area where there was concern, and certainly was an area where some of the breaches started to occur. And we believe this is very much down to individuals using their corporate accounts for inappropriate or unauthorized activities. For example, there was a mention earlier on today about people using some of their corporate laptops for doing schoolwork, etc. But certainly we're seeing, even before COVID, that people are using their corporate assets for accessing certain websites and things that they probably shouldn't have done. And that is very much opening the whole organisation out to that type of weakness. So we viewed this as being a good metric in terms of looking at the overall level of awareness within the organisation. That's really measuring the vulnerability. We've also done some work looking at the overall threat. And basically, we are not trying to identify the scores related to specific financial services. What we're trying to do is look at a basket of currencies. So in other words, to try and take a viewpoint in terms of the level of maturity from the technical perspective for the whole country. And in this instance, financial services. So that overall risk score, as you can see here, each one of those dots represents a financial services organisation. We've taken a viewpoint that they range from very high risk, both in terms of vulnerability and also target, through to very low, where those organisations are providing a very good level of assurance in terms of the technical competence of the security architecture and everything else that goes along with it. So really just trying to provide that as a viewpoint as an overall country, rather than looking at this from the perspective of individual organisations. The representation of the observations, I think, is very interesting. So what we've done is we've tried to look at the use of infographics, and this is really what we're coming to here. So this is a starburst, and it really again just indicates some of the information that we've already provided. But what we've seen from the countries that we've done the analysis on is that they are all falling in the transitional area, which is roughly where we would expect them to be. I think the differences have been that some areas have done really well on some of these key performance indicators, and others have done very poorly. So I think if we can pull together and at least have a common level, we can actually make a difference and start to move towards the sort of organised area. I think the surprises will come when we start to look at some of the more mature markets, particularly with those where we have a significant amount of financial services organisations that have made investments in other companies, have made acquisitions, and are suffering very much from legacy systems and a problem in terms of understanding their full landscape and the way that they patch. And I think, again, looking at the presentations that were run today, that really was a common theme in terms of identifying the most vulnerable parts of the organisations, which are quite often on the peripheries of the organisational structure and technical architecture, and using that as a way to advance privilege towards the real assets of the organisation. So I think our surprises will start to come where we're starting to look at some of what we would perceive as being some of the more mature marketplaces. But I think to have a consistent tool and a consistent way of delivering these sorts of measurements will allow us to do cross comparisons, and it will also allow government departments and others to focus where the spend should be made to make tangible improvements in cybersecurity. I think that's something that's been lacking in terms of some of the initiatives we've seen over the years. In terms of year two, then what we're doing is we're looking very much at concentrating on providing support to the key stakeholders. The key stakeholders that we've identified and we've been liaising and negotiating with and presenting to have been the governments, the regulators, the buying community, in this instance financial services, the service suppliers, training and academia, and professional bodies. So these are very much the areas that we believe that the key stakeholders will come from. And to have an effective ecosystem, I think all of those areas need to work in collaboration to actually move the whole process forward. And the areas in the world where we're seeing the most rapid and most significant changes in terms of the perception and the way the ecosystem is run have been where the collaboration between these groups actually sits. So governments setting national security policy, and very importantly, having key metrics and benchmarks to measure the performance against. But that policy being rolled down to the regulators, who therefore have to look at how those regulated organisations are measured, fits very much into that structure. So in other words, taking that national security policy and understanding how that will be done from a regulatory tool perspective to provide measurement and assurance. Underneath that is the buying community, in this instance financial services, and they obviously have to work to either direct regulation or really underpin some of the basic concepts that the regulators are coming out with. And therefore the buying community, I believe, is the pivotal point here. So in other words, it has to take government and regulator policy, and it has to interpret that in terms of both its domestic and international capabilities. And the buying community, I think, if we can mature that, will actually improve the level of service that's being requested. What we actually want to see, particularly on the incident responders, is proper mature organisations that have got good things in place to begin with. And I think that will help us in terms of both mitigating the opportunity to be exploited, but also reducing the level of damage should those attacks become real and actually got past the defences. So that improvement in terms of the buying community capability is very important. Obviously, the service suppliers we perceive as being a very good indicator of the vibrancy of the market, and particularly in cybersecurity where the resources are limited and where the skill set is very high. We believe that the buying community will continue to look to the service suppliers to help. And in this area, obviously, we're looking at things like vulnerability analysis, penetration testing, simulated targeted attack and response, so red teaming activities, threat intelligence, incident response, SOC provision, etc. So very much orientated towards the type of accreditations that CREST currently provides and our members provide services against. If we're going to make that work, what we have to do is to encourage the very best people into the industry, and therefore working with academia is a very important factor. We want to encourage the very best people in. We want to be able to help them promote cyber security related courses, and we want to encourage the very best people to understand that there is a fantastic career working in cybersecurity, and there are opportunities, and it is every bit as good in terms of a career pathway as more traditional medicine, law, audit, accountancy, etc. But is so much more exciting and actually has a tangible difference to community. So it's very much a community contribution to this. Once we have the individuals in place, then we have to look at the training providers who can therefore provide additional ongoing development. I think whenever I'm asked about the skill shortage, I always break it down that we have a shortage of people within the industry, but then the people that are actually in the industry, some lack the currency in terms of their understanding, and also need to have ongoing professional development activities to understand and keep pace with the level of change that happens in terms of the attack vectors. And then underpinning that, we believe that overall collaboration is very important, and also a sense of community. So I believe that the cybersecurity industry, and particularly in the technology area, is a very much community-based environment. And therefore, if we can work with the professional bodies, we believe that we can help to build that sense of community, which will actually, I think, enhance all of those other areas as well. So in terms of year 2, there's a number of things that we are looking to produce in terms of good practice guides and tools. We are starting to produce a document that is helping to define how to establish national cybersecurity strategies. There is already a really good organisation, some documentation from an organisation called ITU, but what we're looking at doing is to provide interpretation of how that can be done specifically from a cybersecurity perspective, and also building on the data that we have available to us through our maturity model assessments. From an incident responders perspective, then this is really trying to make sure that we're influencing national security policy in terms of the use of CERT-based information, the use of information exchanges, and the national policies on incident response, of which I believe that that's an area where a lot of the national security strategies and policies that we see actually are quite remiss. In terms of national cybersecurity policies themselves, what we're trying to do is to provide advice and guidance to governments in terms of how to ensure their investment is made in cybersecurity, which is actually yielding tangible, measurable benefits. And again, I think it would be fair to make an observation that we've spent an awful lot of money, and organisations have spent a lot of money on cybersecurity, but that hasn't always been focused in the areas where it can actually provide more levels of protection. And a lot of it has been done to actually provide standardisation and reporting aspects rather than actually improve the technologies, where we can certainly see from the presentations today that is where the attacks are actually coming through. And I think that measurable benefit that we'll see from the financial services is a very important consideration. Then we've got how to establish cybercrime units. We've already started some really good work on that with international representation, and it's a very important aspect. It's interesting that there has been some talk during the day about interfaces with law enforcement from the private sector, but it hasn't been a strong message that's come through the presentations themselves. And therefore, I think there needs to still be quite a lot of work done to interface the cyber-related incident response services with the work of the cybercrime units. And I think the closer we work together, the better the overall position will be. And whilst I fully appreciate some of the presentations saying that we shouldn't be heading towards actually identifying exactly who mounted the attack, and we probably shouldn't be heading towards prosecution, and forensics in this area is a real problem, I do think that what we need to do is to have much closer ties with the cybercrime units so that we can support each other. And then finally, that establishment of cybercrime intervention programs to stop vulnerable young people being groomed into cyber criminality activities. We're doing quite a lot of work already with the National Crime Agency over the years. We've established the intervention program in the UK called Cyber Choices. That's taken quite a long time to do, but there was a huge number of hurdles to overcome in terms of protection of vulnerable young people that we had to also put in place. But that is a really good program now. And CREST has run recently some workshops with law enforcement looking at that, and very much we'd like the contributions to come out from the industry to comment on those things as well. So in that area, we have some generic documentation that we'll do to improve the work we've previously done with the National Crime Agency, but also we're taking the lessons learned from both the UK and some of our other industry partners in the European Union in particular to establish how to establish a cybercrime intervention program. Really exciting work and thought leadership, I think. From the regulator's perspective, we are writing guidance about how to use the quantitative data as a regulatory tool. We are both talking to the regulators that I've mentioned in terms of the countries, but this particular topic is very much in the viewpoint of most of the regulators we're speaking to around the globe. So this concept of being able to use quantitative data to validate the level of assurance they're providing across the whole of their landscape and their regulated entities, we believe is a really important thing. As is the use of simulated target attack and response based on threat intelligence to provide that assurance of critical operational functions. Very much based on what we've done with CBEST, very much based on what we've done with STAR-FS, and sort of building on that work and establishing how you can actually get to a level of maturity where you can both procure and consume targeted attack on critical operational systems without having fear that we're going to knock things over and actually cause more of a problem. So this is really thought leadership stuff again. And certainly CREST gets approached by countries around the world to look at this. And I think that the models that we now have actually move people towards a position where they can be mature enough to consume this type of work. And I think our experience in the past is that that hasn't always been the case. So very much we are trying to define the process of moving towards being able to consume this type of information. From the buying community, we're writing procurement guides for each of the disciplines. We have some of those already in place, but we're looking to make sure they're fit for purpose and fit for purpose for the international market. And we're producing maturity models again for each of these areas and disciplines. It's quite interesting that if you look at some of the work that's been done again by the FCA and the PRA in the UK, they're starting to use the incident response and also potentially the threat intelligence maturity models that CREST already has in place as part of the assurance process. So very much looking at using some of the maturity models, some of the more detailed individual company maturity models to gain that level of assurance. And I think, again, listening to the presentations today, I think a lot of the organisations would really benefit from, in particular, looking at the maturity model assessment for the provision of incident response teams internally and how we would utilise the private sector, the service community to actually help during an incident. And I think that would put everybody in a much better position. So if you've never looked at that particular maturity model, it's available on the website, and I would point you towards it. As I say, we're actively looking to improve that right now. So again, any feedback we have on that, we can build into the process right now. As I mentioned, and you could see from the quantitative analysis, there are some areas where really some of the basics is not being done. I'm not saying this is very much basic cyber hygiene, but certainly financial services organisations operating in countries should be meeting what I believe to be a minimum level of technical standard. And what we're doing here is to try to provide further documentation and support for those organisations to understand why it's important and also to understand how they can implement it across their whole landscape, technical landscape. So that documentation is being done, and certainly we'll take feeds from some of the presentations we've heard today to make sure we are considering those from some of the things that have been highlighted as being sort of good practice and things that would help from both reduction of the threat of an attack and also reducing the level of impact. From the service supply perspective, we believe that we are providing some market analysis. So again, all of the information we have available that we've gathered as a qualitative analysis will be made available. One of the things we were surprised about was we didn't see as much information about security operations centres as we expected. And we strongly believe that this is the first line of defence, and certainly from a penetration testing perspective and some of the regulatory assurance schemes, the function of the SOC is absolutely essential to providing that first line of support. So what we would looking to do now is to define why it's so important, and also to make sure there is some documents in place that will give an indication of whether or not your internally provided SOC or the SOC you're procuring from the marketplace is actually fit for purpose and works. As we all know, some of these things are really difficult to procure, particularly where they link into some of the technical elements. And therefore, what we'd very much like to do is to have input from the incident response community to really help us to make sure that the accreditation processes and the documentation that we write around this subject are actually fit for purpose and reflect the current threat scenario that you see. We're also seeing the emergence of threat intelligence, and anybody who's heard me present before will know how important I think this particular subject is to the market. And I think a full understanding of how threat intelligence can be built into the security management function is something I believe is lacking. The CTIPS group is doing a very good job for us in this area, and what we're doing is to utilise some of the material that's already been produced, refining that, and actually putting that into a document that will describe exactly how to put it in terms of the overall security management function. We're then looking at the structure, development and deployment of incident response teams. So again, if anybody wanted to volunteer to contribute to that particular guide, or be on the review panel, then please contact Ali or Debbie on the emails that you've had in terms of the invitations for this particular day, and we will include you in that process. But we're actively doing that right now. And also to look at international standards for cybersecurity service providers, very much based on the accreditation processes that CREST has in place, but taking on board some of the nuances and some of the reliance on some other areas within the industry. For training and academia, again, what we're not trying to do here is to define what a good syllabus area looks like. I think there is some problems with that. I actually quite like the UK's approach to this, where I know what university I would go to if I wanted to learn about security management or security standards. I know the areas where I would go to if I was looking for technical forensics, and I know where I'd go to if I was looking for deep dive technical architecture or penetration testing. And I think that variance in terms of the types of degree courses that are available is really healthy, and we shouldn't therefore nail things down in terms of specific syllabuses. But I do think the lessons we've learned in some countries from moving from more generic ICT or computer science related degree courses and establishing specific ones for cybersecurity, there are some really good lessons that we can learn from that, and certainly we're trying to produce guidance to help with that process. Also, again, the data we have in the maturity model assessments, I think, will be really useful in terms of the training providers to both understand the market, but also understand the gaps in the market and where their services can actually be utilised. And then finally, we are seeing a much greater take-up of professional related certifications, including those, but not exclusively those related to CREST. But what we need to do is to define why that's important in terms of having a career structure in place and moving forward with the overall professionalisation of the industry. So I think this again is an area that CREST has talked about a lot, and we're trying to produce now more specific guidance. And we're also building a careers platform, really, and I think that will encourage more people into our industry, and also for them to have the ability to understand how to progress in terms of their careers. And again, we always make this plea that if anybody's willing to provide a sort of day in the life film for us, they're very easy to do. Literally, we just record you answering 4 or 5 questions. It's a very simple thing to do. But that level of empathy and description about how exciting this career is, what it's like to actually work in, and the good quality people that actually in our industry, it is invaluable, and I think we underestimate how important that is. So if you aren't willing to do that, again, from an incident responder's perspective, I think we are a little bit light on day in the life films in the specific areas of different areas of incident response. And finally, we've been asked specifically by the Gates Foundation, excuse me, to look at challenger banks and microfinance. We've now separated those down. We've already seen some regulators looking at challenger banks already, so we're trying to take some good material from that work. We're already seeing penetration testers starting to do work in this area as well. So we are looking specifically at whether or not there are specific security implications associated with microfinance. Obviously, the microfinance is very different, I think, from traditional banking and even from the challenger bank perspective. And therefore, this will be the thing that a lot of the poorer people in the communities will be utilising. And therefore, we must provide a level of assurance that these microfinance organisations are actually operating in a way that can actually defend and protect data. As I mentioned, we're already starting to do work, again, the security implications for challenger banks. So there'll be 2 documents that come out of there. And we are already asking people to contribute to some of the working groups to put those things together. So again, if you've got any experience in that area, particularly from an incident response perspective, we'd really like to hear from you. And then basically we'll just do an interview to gather some of the information from you. And then very importantly from this particular day, how can incident response services be provided to small businesses? I do think that there is a social responsibility, and we've all done very well out of our industry, and I think we have a responsibility to give something back. And you can see from the presentations today that these are very complex things to do in terms of recovering businesses. They can be very expensive in terms of recovery, and they can be very expensive in terms of procuring services. But therefore, if we want to make these things available to very small businesses, we need to make them available at a cost or at no cost, and that could be consumed by those small businesses. So that industry responsibility for looking at this, we believe, is very important. and we're trying to establish how that could be done. So again, if you've got any ideas, please let us know. And then finally, the establishment of community-based cybersecurity awareness programs is very important. Obviously, there's always talk about the individuals being the weakest link in the chain. I don't always agree with those statements. But what you want to do is to ensure that the community have assurance that these services from the financial services providers are done in an appropriate way, and that individuals and small businesses don't expose themselves unnecessarily to vulnerabilities. So what we're looking at here, particularly in the African and Asian marketplace, is to utilise the existing community-based communications platforms to put forward that cybersecurity awareness message. That's a really quick run through of what I believe is a really important project, and I believe that this is one of the areas where we can actually make a tangible difference in terms of improvement. And I think a lot of the lessons we're learning from the analysis we're doing in the countries that have formed part of the assessment are really relevant. But what we'll be able to do is to extrapolate that into the wider community. And as we get more and more data built into the models, we'll be able to look at that from an international perspective, and therefore I think get a lot more insight. So at that point, if anybody wanted to know more about the project or be involved, then please contact us. But at this point, I'll hand over to answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for that very in-depth and informative presentation with regards to the project, which is, as Ian said, is a really interesting project. And if you do want to get involved in at all, then please feel free to send us an email. So we'll just go into the questions now, and we've had a few come through, but please feel free to type any into the question pane that you may want to ask. It is your opportunity to ask Ian why we have him here, so that's great. But if we start with the first question that's come through, so with regards to all the data that has been collected on this project. You mentioned about a relational database, and also you mentioned about the reports. So how are they going to become readily available? Can you explain that, please?
So from a relational database perspective, we have done all the design specification for it, and what we're now doing is to export all of the data into that relational database. At that point, we will look at all of the individual data items and decide whether or not it can be shared publicly. And I think that's that first premise. We'll say as much of the information should be made available to everybody as we can possibly do. But obviously, particularly on the quantitative analysis, we don't want to release specific information about specific financial services organisations. The relational database, I think, will be completed within the next month and a half. And then what we're doing is looking at the access rights. We will probably do it on a registration basis, purely so that we can understand A, who's looking at the data and whether or not it's useful to them, but B, having an element of control over it. We fully appreciate that you can't control the data once it's provided in the public domain, but just to get an idea of how it's being utilised. We are going to make all of the country reports available as well, and we'll do that either through the relational database or we'll publish them separately, or both. And again, we are, as I said, we finished yesterday doing the final ones of the country level presentations. We'll take the feedback from those, and then over the next month and a half, we'll be in a position to gradually release the individual country reports. But please subscribe to our newsletter within CREST, and that will make sure that as soon as they're available, we publish it. And we're also making available some of the country level presentations that we've done over the last few days. So if you wanted a sort of precursor to it, then again, look out for the CREST YouTube channels and your emails, and have a look at that information as it comes through. I think you'll find it very fascinating, and I think reflecting back on what you've seen in terms of some of what we would class as being some of the more mature marketplaces, I think you'll make some very interesting observations.
Excellent. Thank you very much for answering that one. So moving on to the next one with regards to participation, so in country and obviously from other countries as well. How can people get involved in that way?
So I did mention that we are running a number of activities to write all this documentation. You can see there's an awful lot to get done, and we've got a year to do it. So we very much would welcome the opportunity to have more people participate. And that can be either through actually helping us to write the documentation that we have suggested, developing some of the tools, but also just if you wanted to be on the sort of community challenge or review panels, then please again let us know. So again, if you'd like to be involved in the development of any of this material, or you'd like to track it in terms of seeing where we are in terms of the drafts, then please again just email Ali or Debbie or the CREST marketing email addresses, and we'll make sure you're put on the distribution list. And if you're willing to make volunteers, if you're willing to be a volunteer to actually help us, then again, please let us know. We would very much welcome the opportunity. I think through collaboration, what we'll get is a much better set of deliverables that are going to be much more useful to all of the community and all of the particular stakeholders we've identified.
Great, excellent. And just as you mentioned at the end there, I'm just going to sneak in one last question just before we finish. So with regards to direct contact that you've had with government and stakeholders within the country, what has the participation been like there?
So it's very difficult, you know. CREST is a not-for-profit organisation. We're not a consultancy, and some of the questions we're getting asked at the moment is how do we implement and can you help us? So what we want to do very much is to pass those sorts of opportunities through into our member organisations. But if you take, I'll just use Pakistan as an example, we've been contacted by both the World Bank, who are providing direct support to the Pakistani government, their national policy people, and their newly forming cybersecurity crime unit. Those organisations, including the World Bank, are going to be actively involved in terms of helping us to write the guidance about what a good cybercrime unit looks like. And I believe that level of interest in what we've done will start to multiply. It's really interesting that, as you can tell, we haven't published anything yet in terms of the data findings, but we're already getting governments and regulators from the countries in which we've started the participation coming back to us. And more interestingly, we are seeing direct responses coming back from the Gates Foundation representatives in other countries, and we are being approached by organisations such as World Bank to help with the provision of this sort of general guidance. So I think the message is we will provide as much support as we possibly can. We will help and organise the running of schemes in the same way as we do in other countries. But where it moves into consultancy type activity, we'll very much look to push that to our member community to make sure that they are receiving the very highest quality in terms of the professional content that's available and the very best services that they can afford.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ian. And we've already had somebody that's come in that said it's been a very informative and helpful presentation, and they plan to email CREST to see how they can get involved. So thank you very much for that.
If you could thank my wife or my mother for doing that for me, that's really good. Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, I will do. I don't think that's your wife's name, but I don't know. Who knows? So thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the presentation and all of the presentations today, and it's been a very amazing day. So I am sure that some of you will have been on the presentations before, and thank you for attending those, and thank you for attending this presentation. I will just hand over to Ian to say a last couple of words. Thank you.
So some of the presenters have already thanked Debbie and Ali and her team for organising all of this. I think the virtualisation of these types of events is actually really good for us because we can record more information and we can make it available to everybody. We're already seeing almost a doubling in terms of the number of people that have downloaded the presentations already from those who've actually listened to them. So we're seeing a significant uptake in terms of the people that are registered that couldn't attend the presentations that already start to download them. And then once we put them on the YouTube channel, all those that we can, again, that type of thing will extend quite significantly. So I think it's part of the service that we have to provide to the community as a sort of professional body that CREST is. And I really would thank the quality of the presentations today and from some of the other events. If you haven't listened to them, they've actually been brilliant, really good. probably the best related presentations I've seen from an incident response perspective in a whole group, in terms of all of the physical events I've attended. So I'd really like to thank the presenters for the excellent job they've done, and I'd really like to thank Ali and Debbie and her team for I think doing a really professional job, and as always making these things run really smoothly and really effectively. So my thanks to you on behalf of everybody.
Thank you very much, Ian. And once again, thank you to everybody that has attended. It has been a really good day. And I'll just get Ali and Heike, who have been in the background during the webinars, to just come on and say a quick thank you and a goodbye, and then we'll let everybody get on with their day.
Thank you everyone for attending. And I'd also like to say that the person's just confirmed that they are definitely not Ian's wife.
So yeah, so there you go, Ian, you're fine.
So yeah.
So no, thank you. And obviously I think most of you have got Ali's email, so please feel free to get in touch if you need to get any more information. That would be great. So everybody have a good rest of the day. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.